Allison Tait, who writes as A.L. Tait, is the internationally published best-selling author of middle-grade adventure series, the Mapmaker Chronicles, the Ateban Cipher novels, and the Maven and Reeve Mysteries. Her latest novel is The Wolf's Howl, a Maven and Reeve Mystery #2, and it's out now in Australia and the USA. Allison is a multi-genre writer, teacher, and speaker with many years' experience in magazines, newspapers, and online publishing. She is the co-host of the top-rating Your Kids Next Read podcast and the former co-host of the So You Want to Be a Writer podcast. And Allison has interviewed me before, so now it's my turn. Hello, Allison.
Well, hello. You know, I'd much rather be on your side of the table than mine, right?
Hashtag too bad, because this is happening. I'm gonna ease you in. Tell us about The Wolf Howl, please, and tell us about the series, because you do write these fantastic adventure stories for children. You create these worlds, you have these really likable characters, so it's so easy to slip into them. Tell us about slipping into The Wolf's Howl.
Now, if I was a proper author, I'd have the book, wouldn't I? I'd be like, this is The Wolf's Howl. And I can't even show it to you because while I am all business on top here, I'm actually pajamas on the bottom. So I can't stand up and actually even show you the book cover. But The Wolf's Howl is the second book in the Maven and Reeve Mystery series. I would love there to be more, so go and buy it immediately so that I get to write more of them. The series is about Maven, who is a maid, and Reeve, who is a squire, and the pair of them are sort of swept up in this world of political intrigue. And in The Wolf's Howl, they've been taken off to a castle in the wilds of Glorn, and they have to find a missing cook. They are there for a whole bunch of other reasons. A cook has gone missing. The only person who is really concerned about this is Maven. Maven is not happy with the disappearance of a woman in this castle where, you know, there's a whole lot of business of men going on. So it's a really interesting series to write. There's a lot of layers to it. You know, on one hand, it's a two-hand detective story. And when I was first sort of writing the series, I met Reeve first. And I say met because he kind of just sort of swaggered up to me in his squire's gear. And he was all like, you know, how do you like me so far? I'm Reeve, pretty confident sort of a guy. And he was heading off to become a squire at Renard Castle and desperate to be a knight. And like I draw off, I call them almost history because they're kind of fantasy adventure, but they're very much structured in medieval history and societal stratas and all of that sort of thing. So anyway, he rolls into Renard Castle all ready to swagger his way into knightdom, and he meets Maven there. Now, when I first conceived the idea of the story, I thought Reeve was my sheriff. Like, I thought he was the guy. I thought he was the detective. I was like, I called him Reeve, which is a medieval word for sheriff. So he was going to be my man. He's very politically aware. He's been on his own since he was a page at 7. He's been sort of like working his way through the political strata of these castles. He knows what's what, which was unusual for me because all of the heroes in my previous novels had been the sort of reluctant type. They sort of like find themselves on these adventures. Well, Reeve he's ready for his. So he was the guy. And I started writing because, you know, you're going to ask me at some point, Allison, what's your writing process? And I'm going to say, well, in an ideal world, Sophie, I'd be someone who plans out my entire novel right down to the beat sheet. And, you know, I would know exactly what was going to happen, particularly when you're writing complicated mystery stories. This would be a very good idea. However, this is not how I work. So I had Reeve. I knew that this dazzling jewel had gone missing. I sent him off into this castle and he was the guy. So I started writing the whole thing from his perspective. And then as soon as he met Maven, I knew I was in a world of pain because she was never going to be a background character. She's an observer, but she's not someone who's in the background. So I thought, okay, well, it's a two-hander. I can do that. I can do Holmes and Watson, no problem at all. And as soon as she started speaking, I thought, this is nobody's Watson. What am I going to do now? She's the brains of this operation. And so what I ended up doing, and they're an interesting structure. So they are, all of Reeve's sections are written in third person past. All of Maven's sections are written in first person present. Very deliberate choices because it kind of reflects the worlds in which they inhabit within this greater setting. Maven's world is very small. She is a girl. She's not allowed to do much. So her world and her voice reflects that. Whereas Reeve is, you know, Mr. Man About Town. So he's out and about doing his stuff. That sort of developed, though. I had to rewrite the first 20,000 words of the first book 3 times, I think, before I came up with that sort of structure. So as I said, in an ideal world, complicated mystery stories would be worked out all the way in advance so you knew exactly what was happening. But I can honestly say that in both of the Maven and Reeve mystery stories, the Firestar is the first one, the Wolf's Howl is the second one, I was just as surprised as everyone else to find out who'd done it.
That's part of the fun, isn't it?
Really? Was it really?
And actually, you've saved me having to ask one of my questions, which is when you dream up a new series, well, I'm asking it anyway, do you start with characters or something else? In this case, you started with Reeve, but in previous series, have you started with characters, or has something else, a central device or something, been the first thing you thought of?
They always come from me. I think they come from a question and they come from a feeling. So the Mapmaker Chronicles, which was my first series, actually came out of 2 conversations I had with my then 9-year-old son. He's now 19. So we're talking some time ago, but, just conversations that you have. So we're standing outside one night, we're staring up at the night sky. The reasons we were out there are embarrassing because I dragged him out to have a mother and son bonding moment. And I tell kids this when I go and do my school talks, and you can just see the whole room go, oh. We all laugh, but we were standing out there looking at the stars, and I'm thinking this is a beautiful moment. And he turns to me and says, Mum, how far does space go? And you kind of stand there and you stare out into that universe and you realize we don't know. And it kind of that feeling of not knowing, and it makes your head hurt. And then we were also talking about how they mapped the world. The next night, reading horrible histories, how did they map the world? And, they had to go, they had to get in their boats, they had to go out there, they had to see, they had to do. So that question, how do they map the world? And that feeling of staring into space gave me this idea about a race to map the world. And it also gave me my character, Quinn, the hero, because when I thought about it, so he's a little bit my older son, Joe, and then he's a little bit me, because my first response, if someone said to me, I'm going to put you on a tiny boat, I'm going to send you off onto an endless ocean, we don't actually know where the edges are, pretty good chance you're not coming back, because a lot of people didn't come back in those days, how about it? My first response is, yeah, nah, I'm over here with my book, thanks very much, which is essentially what Quinn's response is. It's just like, I'm fine, thanks, I'll be right. So I think, that's that idea of the question, the feeling, and then who's going to walk into the story.
I guess also it's being alert to ideas being everywhere. So for you, it was standing outside with your son and he posed a question, and obviously that started something in your brain.
Yes.
I would imagine that you do collect ideas because you have written quite a lot of things. So you
absolutely.
Do all over the place.
Yeah, when I do school talks, you got to boil this stuff down when you do school talks. So when I do school talks, I'm always saying to kids, keep a note of anything that makes you ask why and anything that makes you go, wow, because those 2 things are where the stories are. It's a tiny thing sometimes. It doesn't have to be massive. I mean, the Ateban Cipher novels came from an article about the centenary of the discovery of the Voynich manuscript, which is a medieval illuminated codex. They found it in an attic in Poland in 1917 or whenever it was. And it was named after the bookseller who, brought it to market. And the story was basically, the premise of it was about this big. And the premise of it was for 100 years, people have been trying to read this book. No one can read this book. It's all written in code. The language is not related to anything anything else. What could it be? And I got to the end of it and all I could think was, why? Why would you write a book no one can read? So then I wrote the Ateban Cipher novels, 110,000 words to come up with a response for myself. Now, that's a lengthy process for some people, but I just was like, the question of it really, really just captured my imagination. And so I followed it, literally down a rabbit hole, basically.
What do you like about writing in a series as opposed to standalone novels?
Well, I've come to the realization that because I'm actually currently trying to write some junior fiction. I've got an idea for a junior fiction series. And what I have come to realize is that my brain is a very complicated place. And so serious fiction gives me room to create these enormous puzzles and these mysteries and put sort of like clues within clues and characters within adventure. And I think that's what I probably love most about series is that scope, particularly with fantasy adventure, because you can do what you want as long as it makes sense within the world that you create. Like, it doesn't have to necessarily make sense, out here, over there. But as long as it makes sense within the pages of that, and particularly for middle grade, middle grade readers will go anywhere with you as long as you give them a good reason to go there, and as long as it makes sense, because they will pick up so quickly on inconsistencies. I mean, I still go and do school talks, and I'll be standing there and there'll be this kid, Hannah, in book 3 of the Mapmaker Chronicles, you said blah, blah, blah on page blah, blah, blah. And I'll be standing there going, because, I wrote it in like 2014 and I can't remember. I mean, half the time I don't know what day it is, let alone what page I wrote that on. So yeah, you have to be consistent. And also I made the joyous mistake of giving Quinn a photographic memory. And when you have a memory like mine, which is terrible, a photographic memory is a really hard thing to write. I had to keep going back and checking,
You remembered everything.
To make sure he'd remembered everything exactly correctly.
So you've written fiction and non-fiction. You've written for adults. You've written for children. I'm wondering, what are the challenges of writing for children?
Well, it's interesting because I think every children's author has a sweet spot. I think that there's a spot where your voice just like rolls out, and it's interesting because I heard someone describe it as, the spot in your life where maybe you had some major change, or you had there's a significant, time in your life, and often that is the age group that you are, that's your sweet spot for writing. And I would sort of agree with that in a way, because so when I was 10, I had an epic move from the Northern Territory to the south coast of New South Wales with my family. I had been to 4 or 5 schools at that stage. I was at a new school. I was 10. And it was big. And then my brother was born. I'm 10 years older than he is, and he was born like a year later. So it's one of those periods in my life where I think at the time I probably didn't like take notes about, oh, this is a big moment. But when I look at my writing, when I look at where the natural sweet spot is for my writing, it is that age. It is 10 to sort of 13. It's that moment where you can have those big changes in your life. You're on the cusp of growing up. You're on the cusp of going through that massive adventure that is getting through your teen years and becoming an adult. And so that's my natural sweet spot for writing. That seems to be, you can be complicated in that age group as long as you are within the realm of what middle grade is. Now that I am trying to write other things, because I set myself a challenge. I'd really love to get a picture book published. So I've been writing picture books. Not easy for someone who likes 65,000 words to tell half a story. So I'm trying to work on picture books. As I said, I'm working on junior fiction. I'm too complicated for junior fiction at the moment. I need the complexity of the idea without the complexity of the language. So I think it's really important as authors to challenge ourselves and to do different things. And it's also incredibly humbling because you just get it wrong. I've got it wrong, several times, but I also know if I keep doing it and I keep listening to other people and I keep asking for advice and I keep, practicing and reading, the other thing is, reading a million picture books and a million junior fictions. I've got faith I'll get there. It just might take me a bit of time.
Now, you talked about writing for the age of 10, basically, because that was the age which had greatest impact on you, or the biggest change in your life, rather. It seems that you're trying to make sense of the world for you at 10 in a way. And I do think that writers in general are trying to make sense of the world in whatever form that takes, or try to make sense of it for their readers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's also like that age group for me, like as a voracious reader, always have been my whole life, still am today. It's probably what I remember where I read a lot of formative books for me. And I think because that's the sort of age, I think when you get to that sort of 10 to 12 age, you're kind of branching out into bigger books, into independent reading. I run the Your Kids Next Read group and on Facebook, and I see a lot of, people asking for different things. And it's really funny because we joke about the fact that at least once a month, there'll be a conversation about whether or not this particular book is appropriate for a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or whatever. And at least once a month, there's a whole riff-off down in the comments about everyone who was reading Flowers in the Attic when they were 10. It seems to be like, what kids read now and what's available to them on the bookshelves now is quite different to some of the things that we were reading. Now, I was not reading Flowers in the Attic at 10. However, I was reading a lot of Trixie Belden and Famous Five, and I was reading a lot of, Anne of Green Gables, Red Hair. Like, I was just so on board with Anne. So, there was just a lot of books. There was a book called Callie's Castle by Ruth Park, which just spoke to me on so many levels. I've just had a podcast interview about that. It was about a girl who just desperately wanted a room of her own. She was the oldest of, X number of kids, and I was the oldest of X number of kids, and I was sharing a bedroom with my sisters, and it was just, and this idea of having a turret all to myself was just heaven. And you know what? I think I've been searching for that turret my whole life. I'm still looking for it.
Yeah, well, playing Beanie Bow by Ruth Park, I think it certainly shaped me to a great extent, because just that whole idea of dimensions of time being parallel, not just being able to traverse them, but also setting it so firmly in Sydney, which is where I grew up, and having that story in streets that I knew, in landscape that I knew, was formative for me. So Ruth, many people. So which other books were formative for you?
Oh, well, as I said, I'm a strong reader of mystery. I've always been that. So as a kid, that was what I read. I read Famous Five, Secret Seven, Trixie Belden. I read everything on the shelf, Nancy Drew, like all of those sorts of books. And that's one of the reasons that I wrote the Maven and Reeve Mysteries, was because I just wanted to see if I could. Because, you spend your life, I still read crime fiction to this day and love it. And I love a procedural, and I love trying to figure out, beat the author at their game. It's so disappointing to me when you read a book and, you're on page 4 and you're like, oh, he did it. It's just
really disappointing. Yes.
But I'll be watching TV series with my poor husband, we're watching some detective thing and I'll be like, oh, it was him. And he goes, can you just not do that? But, when you read a lot, you get used to what the beats of those things are. And, so I wanted to see if I could write one, because I just think if you're someone who reads an enormous amount, at some point in your life, you get to the point where you think, maybe I can do this. And that's what made me start not writing novels in the first place. I started writing romance novels when I was about 25, because I just thought, I'm just going to see if I can. And, I wrote 60,000 words. Not really a book, but 60,000 words, when I look at it now. But that's how you learn. You do that, and then you do that again. And I've probably written 1 million words, I think, and not all of them published.
Well, because you have to write out those stories, and it's getting away from the idea that every word is precious. The story is precious, and advancing the story is the job. Sometimes those words just fall by the wayside. Whole manuscripts fall by the wayside to do that.
They do. And I think that's a lesson that you have to learn as well, is that not every single thing that you write is a winner. Not every single thing that and sometimes you might write something and then, then it needs to go away and it needs to come out again in 3 years' time. And maybe that's when it becomes a novel. And that's actually, I've got a book coming out in August called The First Summer of Callie McGee, and it's a middle grade novel. It's contemporary. It's a mystery. I'm calling it a cozy detective story for kids. And it's something that I wrote, 3 years ago, and it just wasn't quite right for what I was doing at the time. And obviously I've written a lot of fantasy. And so where I was in my publishing journey was, contemporary is not really where you are, Allison. But the time for it is right now. So it's coming out in August, which I'm excited about. I'm also really nervous. It's funny because you kind of get into the groove of what you do and you know that you do that really well. and then to produce something that is actually quite different. And contemporary is quite different. It's quite, everyone says, I can't believe you create entire worlds from scratch. And I'm like, yeah, it's easier than trying to work within the constraints of the world that we have, you know?
Yeah. Well, given that you love Trixie Belden, as did I, the idea of a cozy mystery for a kid is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. So when you have an idea for a new story and you want to turn it into a novel, or you think it could be a novel, do you have a set process for each book that you follow? Because I have planning documents, or are you a start it and see person?
I'm a start it and see person. My dear friend Allison Rushby, who is a spreadsheet, beat sheet planner, has been trying to turn me into someone who plans for a long, long time. And she rightly says it would make my life so much easier. And it's true, it would. But I have just come to the realization, I always know where my books are going. Like I start, I've got an idea, I know what's going to happen at the end, and that's it. So for me, the middle of a book is always, really heavy going, because momentum will get you through the first 10,000, even 20,000 words. And you can probably do the last 10,000 because you've got an idea what's going to happen towards the end. But that leaves like a fair whack in the middle that requires, pushing through. But for me, the discovery of that is actually most of the pleasure of writing is actually in the discovering process of, oh, of course, that's what's going to happen next, and getting to know the characters. So I have to redraft more than my dear friend Allison Rushby, and probably more than you. But that for me is just part of the process. So the first draft is start it and see, get the story down, get to some semblance of the end. And then I go back to the start and I look at the overall thing. And usually by the time I've got to the end, I've got a fair idea of what I need to fix as I go through. And often, and still to this day, often that also means taking about 5,000 words off the start of the story and beginning at chapter 2. Because chapter 1 is me figuring out the backstory and who's who in the zoo and, all that sort of stuff. But it's just part of my process, but it's a lot slower than here's my plan and can I sell on my plan? Much better idea.
But also to make a plan would be against your nature, because clearly your nature as a writer, and this has worked for you. So even though, yes, procedure may work for other people, planning and procedure may work, if it's not in your nature, I don't think it's advisable to do it. I'm a big believer in that. It's good to know your own nature as a writer and stick with that, work within that.
Well, I think it's a good idea to try both ways. I think it's a really good idea. I did attempt planning. And what I did was I was working on an adult novel. This was many years ago. I was writing an adult novel and I decided that I would, because I wanted to, it was quite a complicated ending and I wanted to make sure I could make it work. So I had written, 40,000 words or something, and I decided that I would plan out the second half of the book. Now, the difficulty came for me in the fact that I had planned it all out. I'd outlined everything. I knew what was going to happen, and I totally lost interest in writing it because I knew what was going to happen. So it took me such a long time to kind of get up the motivation to go back to the book and actually get that manuscript finished, because I knew what was going to happen. So that idea of figuring out, I'm as interested in what's going to happen next as the reader is, because I'm working it out at the same time as the reader is.
But I guess that points to the magic of the process as well, really. And there is a bit of magic in it because, yes, we don't know what's going to happen necessarily, even with my point of view. I don't plan that far ahead. No. I do planning in order to start rather than planning far ahead.
Yeah.
And because I like to rely on that magic element as well, let the characters have some room to do whatever they're going to do.
I just, I don't think I ever fully understood the power of the subconscious until I started writing novels. And I never understood that, you can have stuff going on back here in the cortex that is it's just quietly weaving away. And then you sit down and somehow it is coming out your fingers without even seeming to have a conscious. It's fascinating. And I spend a lot of time, and I've always advocated this. I walk a lot when I write. I weed a lot. I wash dishes. I do a lot of, I call it active meditation because I am not good at sitting still and thinking thoughts. Terrible. So for me, it's like, as long as my body is in motion in some kind of mindless way, and I can just leave my subconscious to get on with it. And if I do that and then come back to my desk, it's somehow, I don't know. It's about it's the trust in the process, and you kind of have to learn to trust it. And I find if you learn to trust it, it means that you don't end up with that thing where you're telling the reader everything on the page all the time. It's like, okay, well, if my subconscious has worked this out as I've gone along, I can probably trust that the reader's going to fill the gaps in too as they go along. Well, fingers crossed. That's the plan.
And I agree about the weeding. It is the best.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very satisfying as well. Now, you have taught and mentored a lot of writers, and I think in doing this interview, we can tell why, because you're so articulate and knowledgeable and experienced. What are the misconceptions about writing that you see over and over again?
Okay, so I think the biggest misconception that I see about writing is that it's this wafty inspirational thing. I think that if more people understood that the way to get a book written is this sort of not very Instagrammable discipline, scheduling, routine. I think if people understood that more, then more people would actually get books, finished. It's that sense of creating a habit, because I met a lot of people who were like, I'm going to write a book one day. Or, if only I had time, I'd be able to write a book. So, I think if people understood that the only way you write a book is to make time to do it, I think and you cannot sit there or actually you can't wander about and wait for the muse to turn up, because, I always say to people, you just have to assume she's stuck in the car park and that she'll be at the meeting about 10 minutes late. So if you start without her, things will kind of roll on. I think that's one of the things that I see. I think the other thing, and I've done this, everybody does this, I'm probably still doing it, is that, that idea of, it's that impatience with wanting to get your work out there. So, I still do it. It's sending out drafts when they're not ready. It's not understanding that publishing works at glacial pace. Like, it's unbelievably slow. I have always said that I am absolutely in the wrong business for my personality type, because the waiting around drives me absolutely crazy. But what I do is use that time well. So I'm not sitting around checking my inbox every 35 seconds. I'm actually just writing something else. And I have got better at that as I've gone along.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of mistakes being made by writers, probably in the execution of ideas rather than expecting certain things to happen in certain ways, do you see the same mistakes being made by different writers? So it's like, this is a common thing that happens.
Yeah, look, I think it's I think people start their story in the wrong place. There's way too much backstory in the first chapter or two, rather than starting in the action. And this is particularly prevalent with children's authors. The other issue I see a lot with children's authors is the focus on the message rather than on the story. There's a lot of, I want to write a book about, changing the world. That's brilliant. But actually what you need to do is write a really great story that implies that message that you want to give. There's an idea, I think, that you have to again, I'm talking about children's authors, that you have to dumb things down for kids. You don't. As I said, that my challenge with junior fiction is not the complexity of the idea, which I am absolutely going to maintain, but I need to look at, I use too many compound sentences, which, early readers can't do. And I use, I'm a big fan of a 3-syllable word in a junior fiction novel. Apparently can't do that. But if you read my middle grade, I use the word that I think is right. I don't use the word that I think that is suitable for a 10-year-old. And I think that that's really important, because you never learn, your vocab never gets bigger if you're not reading stories in which the words maybe require you to ask someone what it means or look it up or something like that. So it's that idea of that you have to kind of talk down to kids. Kids don't need to be talked down to. They just need a great story that's kind of pitched at their age group.
Yeah. And what is the best writing advice that you've ever been given?
It probably came from you, Sophie.
I doubt that very much. But it was probably akin to something you just said, which is just you just got to sit there and do it.
I think so. I don't know. Like, you were always very good at advice. Best writing advice I've ever been. Look, honestly, there's so much great writing advice out there, and there's so much terrible writing advice out there. I think the best advice you can give anyone is to check the source of your advice, like where's it coming from, and only take your advice from people that actually have done what you're trying to do. I think that's really important. Best writing advice I ever got. Oh, finish the damn book. That was the best writing advice I ever got.
Yeah, you can't fix nothing.
Can't edit a blank page, Allison. Yeah, no, finish the damn book.
It is always going to be edited. And actually, I should ask you, because you have written and published a few books now, do you enjoy the editorial process? Some people say they do, or some people might enjoy this structural edit and not the copy edit, or vice versa. So yeah, do you enjoy any part of it?
Well, I will say this up front. I have come to recognize and understand what an absolute privilege it is to be edited, and to be edited well. I really have come to understand that. The first structural edit that I ever got threw me into an absolute panic. An absolute panic. It's very confronting, because until you understand that what you're getting is feedback to help you make your manuscript better, rather than criticism as to why this is not working. If you can flip that on its head and look at it that way, then yes, the editing process is something I enjoy. But I will never, ever get over the confronting aspect of it. Like, I get my edits, all these years later, I get my edits, and it comes in, and so I take a deep breath, and I'll kind of come at it sideways a little bit. I'll open it up and have a quick scan through, and then I'll close it, and then I'll walk away, and then I'll come back to it maybe a day later, and I'll have a proper read of what's going on. And if there's something in there that I am, that really sort of upsets me, which sometimes there is. I remember having a conversation with my publisher about a character in the Ateban Cipher, and she was like, because there's 4 fantastic girl characters in that novel, and she was like, look, maybe we need Destiny's Child here and not the Spice Girls. Like, maybe there needs to be 3 of them. And I'm like, dude, no, she's really important. Like, she's got an absolute role to play in book 2. And she goes, well, I'm not seeing it. So if she's important, you need to put her on the page. And actually, maybe that's the best writing advice I ever got. Put it on the page. Like, you can have a million things going on in your head, but if someone reads it and it's not on the page for them, you haven't done your job. And I think that's that lesson for me was Destiny's Child versus the Spice Girls. I ended up with the Spice Girls, and I was very happy with that. But I think it's important to recognize that if you're going to put a character in a book, it needs to be obvious why they're there.
That is great advice. I'm going to consider that myself. Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, just to veer away from writing and towards music, because this is a books and music podcast. Normally, I ask authors at this point for their favorite musical artists, but instead, I'm going to talk about your son, Joe Visser, who is a very talented singer-songwriter who has released his own music.
He has. Do you know what? I've got a CD here. I don't have my own books, but look.
Oh, Joe's excellent. I was hoping you would. Joe is a great songwriter and a lovely singer. And I'm wondering if either directly or indirectly you feel you taught him about storytelling.
This is a really interesting conversation, because just recently he got asked on a radio interview. He was asked, where did the music come from? And he kind of wafted around a bit about, Dad's CD collection and this, that, and the other. And I sent him a message afterwards. And I'm like, dude, if we're going to build the story here, let's build the story. You can just say, Mum gave me words, Dad gave me music. That's all you need to say. And he's like, oh, righto. Yep. Let's build the myth. Look, he is like, if we're talking about voracious readers, he is that kid. And he has been that kid since he started reading when he was 4. And he's also, he's an unusual, he's a teenage boy he's read poetry, he's read politics, he's read philosophy, he's read, he reads nonfiction, he reads fiction in equal measure. So yes, I think that my influence is obviously in here's a book, throw books at you here. They're ducking books in my house. And obviously we talk, particularly when he was younger, he's not quite as excited about discussing these things with me anymore. But when he was 10, we used to talk a lot about, books and writing and ideas. And he's the guy, he's the How Far Does Space Go guy. So I think, yes, from that perspective, being surrounded by books and conversations about books, being dragged to book launches, being taken to author talks, all that stuff. Yes, that's an influence, but someone who is going to go on with that and read as widely and as deeply as he has, that's all him. I can't take credit for that.
Well, I'm sure you're very proud of him, and no doubt he's proud of you too. Not that teenage boys can say that too often.
Tell me that, but yeah, I'm sure he absolutely. He thought I was pretty cool when he was 9.
It'll still be in there.
It'll come back.
I could talk to you for hours and ask you for advice. However, I think people should go to your website, and I'll put that in the show notes, and find out more about you, because you do teach and mentor writing. Allison Tait, A.L. Tait. What a delight it has been to talk to you.
It's always a pleasure, Sophie. Like, as you say, why don't we just do a series? We could just do this every week. I'll interview you one week. You can interview me the next week.
It could end up being like 2 hours an episode. Well, something to ponder. Thanks, Allison.
Bye.